welcome. This is the Mojo Story, and I'm Barkha Dutt. On the broadcast today, we'll be looking at a fascinating new book that actually takes us back to the 1971 war and the birth of Bangladesh. Long ago, of course, began, in a sense, a certain kind of myth making around the 1971 war. So, for all of us who were not alive at that time, there is a certain simplistic understanding we have of the decision to use the army to birth Bangladesh. Now, a new book by a veteran diplomat and historian, and you see that book on the cover, Chandrashekhar Dasgupta, India and the Bangladesh Liberation War, unveils several untold stories about this war and the birth of Bangladesh. They make us revisit the role of Indira Gandhi, the decision to deploy the military, and whether indeed, as the cliche has several times been asked and raised, whether the war was won and the peace was lost. Ambassador Dasgupta is with us now. Congratulations on an absolutely riveting and fascinating, in a sense, alternative view of history, or certainly a much more textured, nuanced perspective. The most fascinating thing, sir, to emerge from this is the challenging of the trope that the military plan was always on the table. In fact, as your book details, till the April of 1971, Indira Gandhi was actually strongly against this, and she thought it would amount to the interference in Pakistan's internal affairs. How did you actually reach this conclusion? I know you've spent years researching this book. And what does this do to, in a sense, revisit the stereotype of Indira as the sort of warrior princess, the Ma Durga, as even Vajpayee called her, when it came to the 71 war?
Um, Field Marshal Manikshaws popularized the myth that he had restrained an impatient Indira Gandhi from ordering the Indian Army to march to Dhaka in April 1971. There's actually no truth in this story. The Field Marshal didn't see through Indira Gandhi's ploy. She wanted to convince members of her own party who favored immediate intervention that the army was not prepared. She knew that the army had no contingency plans for a major operation of this sort in East Pakistan. In fact, we had limited plans only for two types of operations. One in the event of a Pakistani air attack on Calcutta, and the second, a Pakistani threat to close the chicken's neck, that the Siliguri corridor. But there were no plans for major operations in East Pakistan. And till March 25th, 1971, India had hoped that an Awami League-led government would take office in Islamabad. We were not wanting to break up Pakistan. Rather, we wanted a transition to democracy in Pakistan, a transition to democracy which would bring the Awami League, the party that had won an absolute majority of seats in the National Assembly in the elections, to form a government at Islamabad, because we thought this offered the only opportunity for a breakthrough in Indo-Pakistan relations as a whole, that the West Pakistan military and civil establishment were totally against normalization of relations, and that the only hope was an Army League-led government at the center. This is what we hoped. But we knew, of course, that there was a good chance of Pakistan breaking up. And when finally the Yahya Khan and the Pakistan military decided on this savage, this brutal crackdown in East Pakistan, we realized that all hopes for a united Pakistan lay buried under a mountain of corpses. And it was at that time that we decided to intervene in East Pakistan in order to help the Bangladeshis to win freedom as soon as possible.
your book argues that Indira Gandhi and India were left literally with no choice. That our hands were forced into the birthing or the midwifery role that we played when it came to the birth of Bangladesh.
Yes, that is quite true. What we feared was that if a guerrilla war were to go on for years in what was then East Pakistan, and guerrilla wars do tend to last for years, control of the guerrilla war would pass from the hands of moderate elements like the Awami League into the hands of left extremists allied to the Naxalites and Chinese. In addition, along with the refugee exodus, this would have destabilized our eastern states. We mustn't forget that in 1971, the Naxalite problem in West Bengal was an extremely serious challenge to India's security. And therefore, we thought it was essential to bring this war to a rapid conclusion before it dragged on and there was a transfer of power into the hands of left extremists.
There's also been a lot of folklore around the relationship between Sam Manikshaw and Indira Gandhi, who really called the shots. The image of Manikshaw is one of our most autonomous sort of soldier generals persists. When it comes to 71, how do you see that relationship and the eventual decision to deploy the military?
I think there was no question. The Indian Army has always been under the control of the government. And that was the relationship that existed between Indira Gandhi and Manikshaw. He took orders from the government, quite rightly. That's what a soldier is supposed to do. But Manikshaw was an extremely able general, an inspirational leader of the army. He was also an excellent raconteur. And his skills as a storyteller often got the better of him. And the stories became increasingly colorful as the years went on. And in some of the later versions of this story, you have Manikshaw calling Indira Gandhi, calling the Prime Minister Hindu and offering avuncular advice, to a schoolgirl like Prime Minister. Who was being guided by him. The thing is, Manikshaw didn't realize the political calculations behind India's grand strategy in 1971. P.N. Huxar, who was Mrs. Gandhi's principal advisor, had warned her right at the start of the conflict, at the end of March 1971, that the principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states and of the territorial integrity of sovereign states were firmly established both in international law and practice since the end of the Second World War. This was during the Cold War years. Principles of humanitarian intervention had not come into vogue till then, till actually the end of the Cold War. And Huxar pointed out that no secessionist movement had succeeded since the end of World War II. He pointed to the examples of Biafra, and of course there was also Katanga. Therefore, before undertaking final military intervention, we had to lay the diplomatic grounds for the intervention. This meant, in the first place, building up international support and sympathy for the Bangladesh cause. Secondly, of course, assisting the guerrilla war, provision of arms training. We trained 100,000 guerrillas. Thirdly, to explain to the international community that the matter was not simply an internal affair of Pakistan. Pakistan was exporting its internal problem to India by driving out 10 million refugees into India. destabilizing society, economy of our eastern states. Uh, so this gradually built up the grounds for intervention. Next, you had to take diplomatic measures to ensure an uninterrupted supply of arms through the war. We took measures we entered into the Indo-Soviet Treaty in order to deter Chinese intervention. And even after the treaty, the Soviets required a lot of persuasion before they agreed to give us unconditional support in the Security Council. They said, we'll help you so long as you're just assisting the guerrillas. But if we actually get directly involved, that's another story. And then we had to gradually persuade them that this Bangladesh Liberation War had the characteristics of what in Marxist jargon is a war of national liberation. And it was only at the end of November that we got this thing. But this was essential because without a veto, the operations could have been brought to a halt before a decisive conclusion was reached.
And
So,
yet, despite securing this veto, the truth is, and your book talks about this at great length, the emerging America, China, Pakistan
yes,
sort of axis,
yes,
in a sense, and of course, all the sort of collisions and conflicts that then follow between Henry Kissinger, Indira Gandhi, which is also the stuff of folklore. All of that happens, right? Now, I guess the question would be, I mean, history and understanding and reading history is full of lots of ifs and buts. What made it worth it for India to risk that axis, to risk the axis of then America, China, and Pakistan all together?
well, we realized that there was some sort of an axis developing after Kissinger returned from his first trip to Beijing. And then, briefing our ambassador, he gave him a clear indication that if the Chinese were to move against India, we should not expect American support. Now, in the beginning, we had hoped for support of both superpowers, or at least the understanding of both superpowers. And when it was clear that this wasn't going to happen, we reacted very quickly. Um, Within a matter of weeks, we had concluded a treaty with the Soviet Union, and that sort of trumped the move in the other direction. There was a revolutionary change, a diplomatic revolution that took place midway through the liberation struggle, and we moved in a very sure-footed way to position ourselves in the right place.
To that extent, do you think that it was the 71 Liberation War that for decades, in a way, cast us as closer to the Soviets than to the Americans? That is where the beginning was?
Yes, yes, I think that was a turning point, and unfortunately, the the dispatch of the Enterprise, the U.S. Naval Task Force, headed by the Enterprise, into the Indian Ocean at that time, only reinforced this trend, and it took us some years to restabilize Indo-U.S. relations.
I want to bring you to the oft used cliche, which you do confront and unpack in your book. Indira won the war but lost the peace. She has been ex post facto criticized for many decisions, not pushing for a final settlement of Kashmir when she had the upper hand, returning the prisoners of war, and so on. When you look back at that time, your book actually argues that she postponed the settlement of the Kashmir issue for a later date. Why do you think that happened? Why did you think that she did not take that 1971 victory and convert it into a decisive settlement moment?
Well, in the first place, I'd like to point out that unlike every other Indo-Pakistan war, the 1947 war was not about Kashmir or any objective on the Western Front. It was about the aim of the war was the liberation of Bangladesh, and that was achieved on the 16th December. Regarding Kashmir, we had very limited aims. The aims were to to replace the UN mandated uh, uh, ceasefire line, which came into being in 1949, by a new bilaterally agreed line of control, reflecting the realities of December 1971. And secondly, to shift the emphasis to bilateral settlement of all differences with Pakistan instead of running to the UN or the international fora in general. So the conversion of the ceasefire line into the line of control also reflected this move to bilateralism from multilaterally imposed agreement. Now, she did not want, to immediately at Simla convert the new line of control into an international
And why
boundary.
not? Why did
The,
she not
re-
think
the
that that was
reason
the
is
eventual outcome?
the reason is that she feared that this would bring down a storm of criticism against her for having quote unquote surrendered Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Public
And
opinion
I
in
mean, the
India
irony
was
is
not
that
ready
today,
to
today
accept
we are
it.
still paying lip service in a sense to that
Absolutely,
imagined idea.
absolutely. Indira Gandhi did favor this as a solution in the long run, in the final analysis, but not at Simla. Every Indian draft, including the last draft, the final draft, which was tabled just a few hours before the agreement emerged, makes it clear. I mean, in the last paragraph, reserves a final settlement to a later date.
Do you think that was a mistake? Because look at where the India-Pakistan question is still trapped, right? Every parliament resolution talks about reclaiming Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. That is very much our diplomatic position. But every actual negotiation does talk about the sanctity of the line of control, and
Yeah.
therefore, in many ways, the LOC is what we already consider the de facto border, which is something that could have been finalized and operationalized in that Simla agreement. Do you believe that Indira missed a moment?
I do not think so because the Indian public and the Pakistan public opinion, was not prepared to accept such a solution. There would have been a storm of protest in both countries. I do believe that in the long run, we might inch towards such a solution, but there has to be a gradual movement uh, on how to deal with this border issue. I don't think it can be done overnight. You have to have soft borders, you have to have better understanding between the two countries. You have to approach it with a certain degree of indirection, and you need time. I don't think a major problem like this could have been settled overnight in 1971, or for that matter, as you said yourself, today.
What do you think of her decision to hand back the prisoners of war?
Actually, international law is absolutely firm and clear on this point. The Geneva Conventions require that prisoners of war should be sent back, repatriated, as soon as possible. They cannot be used under international law as political bargaining counters. Had we attempted something of that sort, not only would have brought down on us international condemnation on a grand scale, it would have deprived the Indian armed forces of the protection of the Geneva Convention in any future conflict where Indian soldiers were taken as prisoners of war. It's a totally stupid idea that we could have used these prisoners of war as a bargaining counter.
Let me ask you this. Bangladesh exists. 71 is in a sort of, one of the proudest moments in Indian military history, irrespective of the circumstances that eventually led to to the deployment of the military option. My question to you is this: do you believe that what has often been called Indira's bravest moment, bravest decision, was in fact a moment of compulsion?
Yes, I believe we really had no alternative but to protect our interests, our vital national interests, in the way that we did. It was compulsion. It was also, I mean, her most glorious moment, no question about it. But I think the credit for our historic victory in 1971 does not go to any one person. Uh, it's shared by any number of people. I mean, great credit goes to Indira Gandhi for her indomitable courage, her leadership during the war. Above all, for rising above the temptation to depict the victory as a personal victory or as the victory of a party. She took great care to depict it as a national victory. On the 17th December, when she announced the end of the war in Parliament, she specifically thanked the opposition for their cooperation during the war, which made the victory possible. She took care to involve opposition leaders to the extent possible in the run up to the war about policy. And she always depicted this as a national victory. That was very important. And indeed, a lot of the credit for policy formulation goes to her principal advisors, Haksar above all, but also D.P. Dhar, who played a great sort of role here. R.N. Kao, the head of intelligence, the foreign secretary at the time, T.N. Cole, and Manikshaws, the other service chiefs, provided inspirational leadership to the armed forces. These gallant soldiers who laid down their lives, who made the supreme sacrifice, will be remembered forever in the annals of India and Bangladesh. And then there were the millions of Indians, poor and indigent very often, who, exceeded every expectation of generosity in welcoming the hapless refugees, who shared the little that they had with the refugees from Bangladesh. So the credit goes to the nation as a whole. And our success, our victory in 1971, reflects what our nation can achieve when we embark upon, when there is an overarching national goal. And when we overcome all distinctions of party, of profession, of creed, caste, and so on. That, I think, is the message of 1971.
Oh, absolutely. I was just going to say, so much to learn from for the kind of issues we quarrel over these days as a nation. I finally must ask you, Ambassador Dasgupta. I know you spent 18 years in the researching of this book before it was published. When you began researching it, and as you began to immerse yourself deeper and deeper, what is the one sort of unlearning for you, even as a veteran diplomat? What is this one idea that you were shaped by that you actually found to be absolutely either wrong or completely simplistic?
Difficult to say. I would say there are two things, if I may. The first was I did not know. Okay, let me put it like this. I'll stick to one point. That there was a grand strategy in India's planning. I knew about the military plans, I knew about diplomatic initiatives. What I hadn't realized earlier was that very early in the day, from mid-April onwards, we assembled the elements of a grand strategy which brought into play our military, our diplomatic, our economic assets, which involved all the major organs of the Indian state. Uh, the defense ministry, the armed services, the home ministry, the finance ministry, external affairs, of course, the Ministry of of rehabilitation, refugee and rehabilitation, the state governments. There was a grand strategy in 1971, and that I think is unique in the history of independent India.
And as you said, so much to learn from in how the nation came together in 1971. Thank you, Ambassador Chandrashekhar Dasgupta. It's been a fascinating conversation and a fascinating read of a deeply researched book. I do not remember the last book that took 18 years of research. Obviously, a passion of love for you. Pleasure talking to you, and thank you for the
Thank
book
you
and
very
the
much.
conversation.
Pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.